Yeltsin becomes a left-wing rival to Gorbachev, claiming that Gorbachev is not radical enough in the pursuit of reform inside the Soviet Union. Already back in 1987, Yeltsin was the first member of the Communist Central Committee to resign ever in the history of the Soviet Union's Communist Party. At least one on the Central Committee who hasn't been forced to resign at gunpoint and taken away into the Lubyanka and executed. So Gorbachev is this left-wing, Yeltsin is this left-wing radical who feels himself in some sense marginalized, and even more so after he had resigned from the Central Committee, and his position in the People's Congress of Deputies, despite the fact that he's a member of the Communist Party at this point and they have 87% of control, he is marginalized as well from a lot of the centrists who are supporting Gorbachev and very much afraid of radical agendas. And so Gorbachev is pressuring Yeltsin to the sidelines, to the point that at one point it's believed that Yeltsin had attempted suicide in this period. He is so disillusioned with his inability to advance within this new congressional system. What Yeltsin finds, though, is that there is indeed a very powerful support for him in the Russian populace. He is kind of attracting support from those who are impatient for change, for those who suspect Gorbachev's credentials as a high-ranking member of the Central Committee and his attachment to the former regimes and role in them. And so what Yeltsin finds is this new venue in which he can exercise political power, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. That pink that you see is the primary bottom foundation of the Soviet Union, with part of the USSR, with the Ukrainian SSSR, the Moldavian Republic, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian SSSRs, and so forth. Belarusian are the other partners, but the principal partner is the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and it's based in the White House, maybe a mile from the Kremlin. We can perhaps compare it to, imagine if our federal parliament was in Toronto, and the provincial parliament was, at Queen's Park. So they're both in the same city, but very different jurisdictions. You can see written in text across the entryway, Dom правительства Российской Федерации. And Российской is a kind of derivative from Russian. You might translate it directly as the House of Government of the Russianite government, as opposed to the Russian government. In other words, it's a part of this multicultural ethnic collection of peoples and republics within the Russian Federation, not including Ukraine, Belarus, or the other members of the USSR. And Yeltsin finds himself elected now as president of the Russian SFSR. He wins 57% of the popular vote versus Gorbachev's preferred candidate, Nikolai Ryzhkov, who I think garnered something like maybe 17% of the popular vote. So suddenly Yeltsin now finds himself in this executive position within the Soviet Union as essentially the president of the Russian Republic. And so he now begins to develop this parallel power base, parallel to the Kremlin, that oversees the entire Soviet Union. With these elections in 1989 inside the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries begin holding democratic elections likewise, and they're not discouraged by Gorbachev to do so. And so we see suddenly what had been kind of still a dissident labor movement, Solidarnostists, now actually becomes a party movement, with Lech Walesa being elected and Solidarnostists being elected to power in Poland. And likewise, you begin to see democratic elections in places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, of course, remember, will have a violent overthrow of Ceausescu, but a lot of the other former Eastern European countries begin to, as I say, elect governments that, under the Brezhnev doctrine would have been very quickly suppressed by the Soviet Union. They're not. East Germany, of course, because of that particular unique history of East Germany and its relationship to West Germany, still has the old state system in place. And it's not exactly overthrown, but it begins to collapse itself. In November of 1989, as we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's quite a dramatic moment in our history. It certainly signals the collapse of Soviet power and the Soviet bloc, and Germans will now demonstrate against the repressive East German regime and primarily its instrument of oppression, the infamous Stasi, the Staatssicherheits, or the State Security Ministry. One of the places that these demonstrations, mass demonstrations, are taking place is in Dresden, where demonstrators form a human chain around various Stasi facilities and threaten to actually break down the doors of one facility and loot it and expel the secret policemen who work there. And of course, this is very scary for the intelligence operatives, as of course you might remember those pictures of Hungarian secret policemen being dragged out by the scruffs of their necks from their police headquarters in Budapest and being lynched from trees and summarily executed against the walls. Among the Stasi personnel sheltering in one of those facilities is a Russian KGB officer stationed in Dresden, East Germany, Vladimir Putin. He is there under the cover of the Ministry of Staatssicherheit, the state security, a major in the Foreign Espionage Directorate of the KGB. Putin is yet of the next generation following Yeltsin and Gorbachev. He is a post-war child born in 1952 in Leningrad. His grandfather was a cook for Lenin and later Stalin. His father had been a Navy conscript and later in the Red Army. His father had served during the war in an NKVD destruction battalion. Only 4 of the 28 men in his unit survived the war. Putin's mother was a factory worker. His father was severely wounded during the war. His 2 older brothers, one died in infancy, the other died in the siege of Leningrad from a combination of starvation and diphtheria. Putin's maternal grandmother was executed by the Germans. His maternal uncles just vanished. Putin was not a avid member of the various communist youth groups like the Boy Scouts, the Pioneers. He had never joined the Pioneers. After the war, his family lived in abject poverty. In a single room in a communal apartment with no hot water or a bathtub and a communal toilet off the staircase. Putin is remembered by his contemporaries, including one of his school teachers, as having spent most of his time chasing rats with a stick around their apartment. He is, however, a clever child. And as an adolescent, Putin is initiated into this quasi-secretive Russian warrior order without a name, kind of like the Jedi warriors from Star Wars, where they study chess and what was recently prohibited, the martial arts of judo and sambo. It had been prohibited in the Soviet Union until Stalin's death as some kind of foreign enemy influenced martial art. And so it was only recently that the ban had been lifted, and Putin apparently has quite a talent for it. Putin, to this day, practices sambo, a kind of a Russian version of judo. He does have a black belt in it. And as far as chess goes, there is a kind of a, mixed reviews of, on Putin's mastery of chess. He's not particularly a avid chess player, but nonetheless, in terms of how he works as the current Russian president, he's often described and characterized as a chess master. In fact, when Obama came to negotiate with Putin over foreign policy issues, this is the kind of cartoon that characterized the sophistication of the American approach to foreign policy and Putin's approach. Foreign policy chess. as Putin famously is quoted, quote, "Negotiating with Obama is like playing chess with a pigeon. The pigeon knocks over all the pieces, shits on the board, and then struts around like it won the game," end of quote. Chess master or not, certainly Putin is an effective foreign policy advocate for making Russia great again. No question about that. Putin is a popular child among his peers. He had always wanted to become an officer in the KGB. The KGB, very much in the way here the FBI or the CIA are promoted as often heroic figures, although certainly in American culture, we can say it's 50-50 on the CIA. Certainly in cinema, sometimes they're villains, sometimes they're heroes. The KGB kind of has the same status in Russian popular culture, the sword and shield, first of the revolution and then of Russia itself. So from an early age, Putin had ambitions to be a KGB officer, and to qualify himself for that, he enters law school in 1970. He will begin studying law. This is a picture of him with his mother as a early student. And upon graduating law school, he will apply to the KGB around 1975 and is recruited in the KGB. He is around campus a popular, athletic, charismatic figure, well liked by his peers. He, has dozens of girlfriends. He's considered dashing and handsome. And very soon after he goes to work at the KGB, Putin will marry in Leningrad. And on the eve of his first posting abroad, which will be to East Germany, to Dresden, he will have his first child, a girl. Here is Putin again with his mother and another family member just on the eve of his deployment to Germany, East Germany in 1985 as an undercover operative for the KGB in Dresden under the auspices of the German State Security Ministry. His wife and daughter will accompany him, and in Germany they will have a second child, a second daughter that Putin brings up in his in the KGB station, essentially where they're stationed. Here you can see Putin's East German papers. We could see, interestingly enough, every 3 months, the kind of identification stamp, authenticity stamp on the paper is updated with an interesting absence, never quite explained. In the winter of 1986, the last quarter, he apparently was deployed somewhere else, probably a Russian state secret to this day. Nonetheless, he has the rank of major at this point, and he will operate, as I say, out of this building in Dresden. And this is the building that gets now surrounded by these mobs. And Putin becomes alarmed that the mobs may breach the building, the house, and capture all the documents that, operational papers of the KGB that is inside. And Putin will recall how, as the mob begins to press against um, the building, he calls Moscow KGB headquarters for instructions on what to do, whether to destroy the KGB archives in Dresden or not, and nobody answers the phone. The line is dead, essentially. There's nobody in charge in November of 1989 on the night desk in this crisis as the Berlin Wall is collapsing to give Putin his instructions. And this will forever radicalize Putin, this moment, um, for everything that he'll become in the future. He realizes, as this young KGB officer, just how weak the Soviet Union had become at home, including his own elite foreign directorate in the KGB. And so Putin, on his own initiative, puts the archives into the furnace and stuffs the furnace with so much archival material that the furnace actually cracks and bursts. And Putin will now return back to the Soviet Union. He will be promoted to lieutenant colonel and will resign from the KGB in 1991 during, shortly after the failed coup attempt that I'm about to describe to you. But this is the making of the current Russian president, Vladimir Putin. As Warsaw Pact countries drift away into their own policies and their own spheres of interest, the Soviet Union also begins to disintegrate from the inside, particularly in areas where there were ethnic or religious rivalries. One of the first kind of cracks in what was still a relatively civil society, even under communism and the kind of the repression of communism, is the ethnic and religious rivalries between Christian Armenia and Muslim Azerbaijan inside this territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which in fact, oddly enough, just a few months ago was in the news. But in this ethnic enclave, which is contested by both the Armenians and the Azeris, horrific violence and warfare breaks out. The kind of warfare that Russia had not seen since the Second World War. And this fighting, of course, is occurring as in 1990, as Gorbachev's policies and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact begin to trouble both conservative and progressive Russians. Is Gorbachev actually leading us towards a kind of new civil war? And certainly that's what's occurring in that region between Armenians and Azeris. This kind of ethnic cleansing on both sides, reminiscent of what's going to happen in Yugoslavia as well. And so there is an overall now fear of just upheaval everywhere in the Soviet Union. The goals of the forefathers from Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and Gorbachev suddenly taking all that history into a different direction is certainly under question. There is an issue facing Gorbachev that has faced all reformers, you know, including Louis the 16th. The question of the law of rising expectations, the reform sometimes implemented by dictatorships and dictators after they have second thoughts on the wisdom of what they had been doing or in its sustainability, are not often graciously taken. And you have this, again, notion of the law of rising expectations. It's exactly as when King Louis in France attempted to reform French society and the bread supply and the relationship between the estates, is exactly when the French Revolution broke out. So, as I say, we know it as the law of rising expectations. And certainly, as you can see from this cartoon, it's something that Gorbachev's reforms now are presenting as an obstacle to Gorbachev's attempt to slowly and rationally reform the Soviet Union. It's beginning to get out of his control. Well, commemorated in this Canadian cartoon that appeared in the Vancouver Sun, as our own tyrants were toying with reforming the Canadian structure. And this is the moment that I went in to shoot that movie I put online for you, Mondo Moscow, which was commissioned by TVO and the Chum Group. Here are what you saw in or will see in Mondo Moscow. I shot in the autumn of 1990. I was there for the last October, Red October parade. By next year, the Soviet Union would be on the brink of collapse, and certainly the Communist Party will have been banned in Russia. And everywhere I saw, there was a fear of a possible reversion to old style Stalinist repressive measures, a lot of kind of, again, confrontation of trauma from what the Russians referred to as the repressions. And I'm talking about the purges under Stalin that killed millions of people and enslaved millions more. There was a fear of a coup by communist hardliners, resulting in a possibly a catastrophic civil war. And as well, there was kind of a fear of what might happen. Russians were referring to the so-called Pinochet syndrome. Pinochet, of course, was the general who headed the military junta in Chile that replaced by force and killed the democratically elected Salvador Allende. The Pinochet syndrome was the possibility of a right-wing coup in Russia that would introduce a capitalist free market economy to Russia, but one that's maintained by death squads and secret police repression, just like Pinochet did in Chile after his overthrow of Allende. And so this painting which, again, in my documentary, Mondo Moscow, Eric Bulatov describes as his expression of his fear of how Gorbachev's perestroika in the forefront is going to be perhaps overwhelmed by the past revolutionary historical matrix of Lenin and Marxist Leninism. And indeed, the end, I think, of the peak of what was this kind of socialist affluence that I have been describing in the past lectures comes effectively to an end August 18, 1991. Same street, different view. It's the coup attempt when a cabal of old school communist functionaries in the Central Committee with the assistance of the KGB and its, at that time, director, Khrushchev, formed the so-called State Committee on the Extraordinary Emergency, the GKCHP, and attempt to seize power using the military. Gorbachev at that point, typically August, is on vacation away. I think he's in the Crimean region. He's put under house arrest in a classical coup attempt. And perhaps classical is exactly the error that these old dinosaurs had made. They certainly quickly seized control of Russian television, but did not, for example, take control of the telephone lines or of fax machines. And Russians were faxing each other plans and information and newsletters. They did not cut off the telephone system from abroad. There was a way that Russians, if they put their television on the windowsill, could receive CNN that was kind of being broadcast into the US embassy. And so you could get a very weak CNN signal live of what was happening in Russia. These guys never thought of, probably didn't even know that that was a possibility. And so very quickly, Russian opposition was organized against this coup attempt from the top, from the communists in the Kremlin. People began to confront the military deployed into Moscow, and partly because many of the troops who were deployed into Moscow were local troops, unlike, the Chinese who deployed soldiers from other regions of China to suppress the Tiananmen Square demonstrations that were also inspired, by the way, by what Gorbachev was doing in the Soviet Union, kind of the openness in the Soviet Union. These troops were more susceptible to the public pressure that was beginning to arise in Russia. You're looking at the Moscow Communist Party headquarters, and you can see how many demonstrators have gathered in front of the headquarters to protest what was occurring. And so crowds began to very quickly confront the Soviet troops that were deployed by this emergency committee and engage with them, eventually resulting in many of the Soviet soldiers deployed to put down the Gorbachev reforms to actually now take side with the people. And here on the sign, you can see attached to the tank with the communist hammer and sickle equals a swastika. The script there says, Yeltsin, the people are with you. Indeed, Yeltsin will now, to his credit, become the symbol of resistance to this attempt at an overthrow. And suddenly the red banner with the hammer and sickle is replaced with the flag of the Russian Republic, which is the former white, blue, and red standard of Imperial Russia, old Russia, a flag that had been prohibited and rarely seen in Russia until Yeltsin begins running for the Russian provincial parliament. Again, Yeltsin has this formal position as the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to act inside of Russia and deal with the coup that's emerging down the road from the Russian parliament in the Kremlin. And so this resistance to the coup begins to centralize around the so-called White House. As barricades go up, people begin to gather around the White House. Yeltsin declares the Communist Party inside the Russian Federation as now being an unconstitutional revolutionary entity. It's something that he doesn't have the power to necessarily do in the Ukraine or Belarus or the other socialist republics, but within the Russian Federated Socialist Republic, he has a good claim on authority to do that. He becomes this rival power center to the Kremlin in these days of August. And of course, this is covered on live television that everybody is watching. And Yeltsin now becomes this heroic figure as people begin gathering outside the White House to hear what he has to say. And here you can see not only Russian officers siding with him, but as well security officers holding these portable, bulletproof, kind of bulletproof, unfoldable briefcases. They're not exactly vests, but they're portable, bulletproof body armor that they're holding around Yeltsin. And there's a good reason for that. The same KGB team that assassinated the president of Afghanistan back in 1979, the KGB's Alpha Group, had now been deployed to take out President Yeltsin, the Russian president. And so KGB snipers actually had Yeltsin in their sights. And yet the KGB made the decision to disobey the orders they had to kill Yeltsin and stood down without assassinating Yeltsin at that point in history. And I think it teaches us in many ways the power of just 6 years of democracy and maybe not democracy, but at least an open discussion of the past that enabled these highly indoctrinated and well-trained KGB officers to make a momentous decision in terms of choosing whether to go with the coup that their chain of command had ordered or whether to go with the people. And that applies to as well the soldiers of the Red Army who were deployed to Moscow. And so Yeltsin survives. And Yeltsin now declares the Communist Party as a banned party inside the Russian Republic. The Kremlin is essentially rendered powerless. And you know, the 5 years plus detente had essentially developed a society in the Soviet Union by that point that would not tolerate or allow for the kind of old time conduct that the Bolsheviks had become accustomed to over their rule in Russia since 1917. The statue of Dzerzhinsky in those days in front of the KGB will be taken down by the mobs and remains down to this day. There will be promises of reforming the KGB, but of course, nothing of the sort will happen. But certainly, this is a symbolic challenge of the KGB's role in society. And Lenin now himself comes under attack, as does the Communist Party, as it becomes outlawed. And there are talks of kind of Nuremberg war crime type trials for the Communist Party and its members. Gorbachev is rescued and from captivity, and he's brought back to Moscow, escorted by Yeltsin's security officials. And of course, famously, when Gorbachev attempts to reinstate order, Yeltsin now begins dictating him the new terms. The Communist Party is out. The Russian Republic is now something new. And Gorbachev will never again, after this August coup, regain any kind of initiative inside the Soviet Union. He'll kind of become a lame duck president for 3 months. And as various countries begin to vote in a referendum at the end of 1991 whether to remain as part of the USSR, most of them decide that they will maintain a kind of relationship under what's known as this the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, but each one will now um, govern themselves. Belarus, the Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, of course, have been desperate to get out of the Soviet Union since their occupation by the Russians back in 1940. And so at the end of 1991, the red banner at the Kremlin is taken down. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceases to exist, and the old Imperial Russian standard is raised at the Kremlin, and the USSR becomes the CIS, but really it becomes the Russian Republic, and Gorbachev resigns. And I was there on the last days of the Soviet Union, and it came to an end with a whimper. Essentially, there was no bang. There were no great parties in the streets. It just happened on television. Essentially, Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and people just quietly moved on, dealing with all the problems that the Russians were now having by the end of 1991. It was, kind of a tired, sad end to this experiment, essentially, a very utopian experiment that ended up in this utopia that the USSR became. The Yeltsin essentially felt that now it was too late, um, and so for any kind of reform of the type that Gorbachev, any kind of moderate reform or gradual reform that Gorbachev was militating for, and so Yeltsin and George H.W. Bush are going to form a partnership. The Americans now become Yeltsin's partners in an attempt to integrate Russia into the Western market economic system. This, of course, called for IMF bank loans and credits tied to radical austerity programs at home, a program of privatization, which actually will be a cold word for the looting of the Russian people's state's assets. Putin at this moment is working for Anatoly Sobchak in Leningrad, and he will be involved in a number of questionable financial transactions taking place in food supplies being brought in by Sobchak for Leningrad. He will attract Yeltsin's attention and eventually will be brought to Moscow by Yeltsin, will become a functionary in Yeltsin's government, including becoming chief of the FSB, the former Internal Security Directorate of the KGB. As you know, the KGB will be split into two different agencies, the FSB for internal security, kind of like the FBI, and the SVR for external intelligence, kind of like the CIA. Here's Yeltsin with Sobchak. Hand-chosen oligarchs will now, as I say, loot Russia through the privatization system. The way it worked is all Russians are given shares in, the oil company, the railway company, and the gas company, and all Russian industry. But they're so desperate that these oligarchs, with mostly illegal money that they had made during the reforms. These guys are all mobbed up. Essentially, the Russian mafia becomes very powerful. Traditionally, the Russian mafia had always had a relationship with the KGB, and so these oligarchs begin to buy up at discount prices all these shares from ordinary Russians who, desperate to unload this, what they feel is useless paper for, fraction of a penny on the dollar. Essentially, these guys just loot the entire Russian economy, along with money advanced to them by Western partners from England, Germany, the United States, and other Western countries. Guys like Mikhail Horodovsky form Yukos, the huge oil company. Berezovsky and Gusinsky take over all the media, newspaper, television broadcasting under Yeltsin, and become his kind of hardcore partners. And Yeltsin, of course, is paid off, by everyone. He becomes enormously rich from his friends. The people are abandoned, essentially. And this is partly Western so-called shock therapy doctrine of Western market economics. We saw it happen in South Africa when Nelson Mandela took power and attempted land reform in South Africa, it immediately put any kind of international monetary fund assistance or World Bank assistance at risk unless he abandoned all kind of socialist land reform programs. And that's part of the reason that many in South Africa now live worse under under freedom than they did under apartheid. The same thing is going to be happening in Russia now. Workers are left unpaid. The pensions are worthless. In 1992, the first year of reform introduced by Yeltsin's globalists, the Russian inflation rate skyrockets to 2,500%. And it has a double effect. One, the price of food and ordinary consumables went up 25%. And second, the savings of pensioners were wiped out. If someone had 100,000 rubles saved up, it turned to 4,000 rubles. And now the shelves went completely empty. During Gorbachev times, there were shortages, but under Yeltsin, it was catastrophic. There was nothing. At best, when you went into a Russian state supermarket, you would get to look at pictures of food on paper at the bottom of the cooler. Meantime, those connected to the oligarchy who had maybe dollars in their pockets or an excess of dollar-bought rubles, nothing was on the shortage list. Everything was available to them. And so this small percentage of Russians who were, quote, with it, were able to comfortably sustain themselves while the rest of Russia began to die off. The age-adjusted mortality in Russia rose by almost 33% between 1990 and 1994, as the entire state health system collapsed under Yeltsin. Something that Americans were telling Yeltsin was communism, just the same as Obama when he tried to introduce state health insurance and mandatory health insurance for Americans, was told that, this is communism. The Russian GDP, you can see, collapsed under Boris Yeltsin, as did the life expectancy of your average Russian. Here you can see between 1991 and 1999, the particular dip. During this period, life expectancy for Russians declined dramatically from 63.8 to 57 years old for men, and from 74.4 to 71.2 for women. While in the same time in the United States, life expectancy increased for both men and women from 71.8 to 78.8 years to 72 and 79 years, respectively. More than 70 million Russians fell into poverty, while a quarter of them lived in what the World Bank described as desperate poverty. By the 1990s, a lot of Russians were very fondly remembering the stagnation and regretting the absence of now the communist system that had kept them at least uh, clothed, fed, and their health and education covered. But this kind of austerity program is what was imposed by the West on the Russians if they wanted to rejoin the market economy. That's the price to be paid. Yeltsin Yeltsin will now drunkenly drink and dance his way um, through the 10 years of his presidency. As Russians are dying from poverty and health problems, the Russian parliament, the very one that Yeltsin protected, attempts to rein him in, and his policies as well. Yeltsin now is too much in debt to the West and depends upon it. And so Yeltsin refuses to moderate the westernization of Russia, certainly in the economic sphere. And so Yeltsin unconstitutionally dissolves the Russian parliament. The Russian parliament, in response, impeaches Yeltsin. Yeltsin's response in October of 1993 will be to bombard the Russian parliament into submission, essentially destroy it. What a difference 2 years of International Monetary Fund, IMF, grants and loans make to a country. Very cornerstone of the defense against this totalitarian coup that was attempted in 1991, 2 years later, becomes the victim of yet another totalitarian attack, this time at the hands of the very man who was supposed to protect it, the very man who nurtured it, Yeltsin. And that, folks, is the end of democracy in Russia. It lasted at best 3 years, from 1989 till about 1992. Let's say 4 years, until October of 1993, when Yeltsin finally bombards the parliament into submission when it attempts to maintain its constitutional privileges. And democracy will never return to Russia after that. It was a very, as I say, short period that begun under the Gorbachev's communist administration and ended under Yeltsin's dictatorship, essentially. A form of civil war that fortunately did not spread like wildfire into the rest of Russian society. Russians, long used to repressive governments and regimes, essentially, once they saw the kind of force that Yeltsin used against the parliament, that even the Kremlin coup attempters dared not to. Once they saw that kind of force, they certainly now stood down, as I imagine a lot of Russian people would have, had the communist coup open fire on that parliament the way, when Yeltsin was standing on the barricades in front of it. This is a kind of an image from Russian propaganda reminding us that indeed, um, by then, Bill Clinton was the president, that they had applauded and congratulated Yeltsin on his determination to implement IMF advocated market economic reforms inside of Russia, even with force if necessary. This again is from Russian Putin era propaganda. And as all propaganda, there's kernels of truth in it. By in this period, I am back working in Russia. Um, I'm one of the first journalists to be given KGB accreditation in that short period where the KGB was trying to modernize itself. And, they were selling T-shirts. You could get tours of KGB headquarters the way you could at one time of FBI headquarters. There were KGB coffee mugs and so forth, and these little kind of joke press accreditation that were similar to the kind of accreditation a KGB officer would carry. The way it worked is you would just hold this little booklet closed in your hands, and would get you to the head of the line or a seat at a table in the restaurant and so forth. So we in the press corps loved having them. I ended up deployed by the CTV News to go undercover into nuclear material smuggling rings in a special that CTV produced with Discovery Channel and a whole bunch of European broadcasters as well, called The Hunt for Red Mercury. And that took me into the breakaway um, republics of what we call the Berserkistans, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so forth. And these, of course, were independent under the Soviet Union's Soviet socialist republics. But the one in particular that I was sent to, one that is critical to the pipeline and oil supplies, and in fact the source of high grade oil that can be used in the production of um, the production of um, jet fuel. And that's this breakaway republic inside of Russia called Chechnya, right there. Chechens have a long history of antagonistic relations with the Russian state since their conquest in the 19th century. Stalin expelled the entire Chechen people on one day, February 23rd, 1944, known as Black Wednesday, when every Chechen man, woman, and child were deported into the far reaches of the Soviet Union. Stalin had considered them as dangerous and disloyal. He thought they would have collaborated with the Nazis. The Chechens have always resisted Russian rule, anyway. And so, in one day, he deports the entire population. Those who refused to leave Chechnya were summarily executed. Once Khrushchev came to power, Chechens, one by one, on their own, returned back to their homeland and began to rebuild the society that Stalin had destroyed. Chechens belong are part of a Sunni Muslim sect. They practice a kind of mystic Sufism, a kind of a mystic um, cult within Islam, kind of the cult of of sacred circular Islam. Um, they perform this kind of a circular prayer dance, often referred to as dervishes sometimes, but zikir is their term for it. Lots of singing and dancing, and women are essentially more integrated into Chechen Islamic Sufism. Veils were not worn, certainly not when I was there. Women are very much active among Chechen warriors and often accepted as equal partners in politics and combat and resistance and so forth. I often saw elderly Chechen women armed with Kalashnikov assault weapons. They were guards at the Chechen presidential palace. And in fact, this is a photograph of the bottom of the palace. This is what it looks like. The leader of Chechnya at that point, who declared um, independence from Yeltsin, was Dzhokhar Dudayev, whose motto was, "We must take our right and live like a wolf, proud and alone." And in fact, the wolf is the kind of national animal of Chechnya. Chechens are themselves divided into a number of clans that sometimes war with each other, sometimes don't. Um, Chechens also, there's a large Chechen population, diaspora. Many of them are, for some reason, many Chechens are adapted as pilots. And so, for example, the Jordanian Air Force has a lot of diaspora Chechens who left Russia even at the time of the revolution and ended up in Jordan. And typically, Dudayev was a member of the Red Air Force, and quite a senior one. He eventually rose to the rank of general and was in command of a nuclear bombing squadron in Soviet era Russia. He was one of the highest ranking Chechens in the Air Force. And once the reforms that Gorbachev implemented began to take hold, Dudayev returned to Chechnya, resigned from the Russian Air Force, and ran as president and was elected and declared independence from Russia. And of course, this was problematic because unlike Ukraine, Belarusia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, which were Soviet socialist republics within the USSR, Chechnya is a republic within the Russian Federative Republic. So, constitutionally, a very different relationship to Moscow. And so, technically, it was seceding from Russia as opposed to from the USSR, or later the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent State, as the USSR became known after its fall. And this was problematic for Yeltsin, as it was, the issue of oil reserves, which, by the way, Dudayev began to share with the Chechen people, kind of like the way the Saudis do. And so there was quite a lot of wealth inside of Chechnya that I saw, throughout the population as Chechens began to derive this kind of income from the oil reserves in Chechnya that Dudayev had seized. And um, on my arrival in Chechnya, already there were factional battles inside of Chechnya between the various clans, including the clan that backed Dudayev, and as well clans that were co-opted by Moscow, who were ready to work with the Russians and ready to work with Yeltsin. And so this fighting was already kind of low intensity fighting breaking out in Chechnya. And the Russian military, of course, in support of the pro-Moscow clans itself, started becoming a target as Soviet helicopters were sometimes hijacked and taken down by Chechen rebel groups or seized from Chechen clans that were being supported by Soviet air power. And so all that early period stuff, I ended up documenting, as I say, deep inside Chechen society that I found myself embedded in with some of these warriors and child soldiers and, kind of dervish warriors, essentially. A lot of them went to battle still wearing their Afghani medals. Many of Chechens had fought in the Red Army against the Afghanis, and as I say, proudly wore their Soviet era medals as they were going to war with the Soviets themselves. We became fairly close, as anyone would, as I say, when you're embedded with a group. And my sound man and myself began in some ways mimicking what the Chechens do. We both acquired AK-47s of our own, which we carried as the period now, became dangerous for foreign journalists. Body armor was not really yet worn by journalists as much as it will be in the later 90s and the 2000s. But yet at the same time, kind of respect for journalists began to crumble. And so by habit, we started going around armed ourselves, very much like the Chechens we were surrounded with. The Chechens themselves, I think, were, you can see vodka on the table there. So they were the kind of Muslims who would have a shot of vodka or, smoke a joint. There was a lot of cannabis in Chechnya. They would, smoke a joint or have a shot of vodka before they go to prayer at the mosque. That's how how Muslim they were, kind of like Turks were not that long ago. Obviously, that no longer is the case for Chechens today, considering what the Russians would do there over a period of 15 years. But certainly, it was a much more open society at that moment than an independent of everyone than it's going to be in the future. So I was welcomed in their homes, incredibly hospitable people. The city of Grozny itself was a fairly modern city, kind of in that Central Asian way, typical of Soviet Central Asian cities. It never was destroyed by the Germans. The Germans didn't get far as Chechnya. They got close, but didn't quite get to it. They would have, of course, the Germans were driving, they needed to get through Stalingrad to get to Baku on the Caspian Sea, and that's where Chechnya is as well. But they didn't. But the city of Grozny was relatively modern, suburban-like city. Parts of it, for some reason, to me were reminiscent of Etobicoke around Islington Avenue. It had that kind of feel to it. It's hard to describe, but when I look at this picture, I kind of think of Etobicoke for some reason. This was the central square where the parliament is located, and I was based in this building here, in a suite of rooms where my office was in this hotel, which was kind of a Star Wars bar at that point, as there were a lot of rebel groups fighting in Georgia at this moment. You may remember that as well. One of Gorbachev's shining knights, Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, he was often the face of, progressive policies of Gorbachev. Shevardnadze actually was a demon who returned to Georgia and then overthrew the democratically elected president Gamsahurdia of Georgia, and Gamsahurdia ended up in exile, hosted by Dudayev. In this hotel. So the floor below me, all of Gamsahurdia's militia and general command were there, and they were fighting a war on the Georgian border to try to retake Georgia from Shevardnadze's factions. This is the view I kind of had from the balcony and the street below. Typical, as I say, Soviet era. I felt like I was in the 1970s somewhere. A typical Soviet era Central Asian city. With off this square was the actual presidential palace where Dudayev worked. And I would often, with my camera crew, visit Dudayev and filmed on behalf of CTV. A lot of interaction between Dudayev and the clans and what was happening. So, as I say, this was my daily view from my hotel room in the Kafkas Hotel in Grozny. This, of course, Yeltsin will turn into this. Once Yeltsin finishes bombarding the Russian parliament, he'll now proceed to brutally put down the Chechen independent state. Dudayev himself will be assassinated by a missile that tunes into his satellite phone signal. And so as Dudayev makes a phone call on his satellite phone, the missile tracks down that signal and kills Dudayev. And that's the end of Chechen independence. There you can see the Kafkas, the back of the Kafkas Hotel, and the parliament. The parliament and presidential palace kind of become, for Russian attacking troops, the Reichstag of this particular war. 2004, 2005. And it's a brutal kind of destruction of a nation, reminiscent of what occurred in Berlin in 1945, this kind of conventional war where citizens are just trapped in it and slaughtered. Nothing was left of the city I was so familiar and in some ways fond of. Hundreds of thousands of people will die in this fighting. And there was a very large population of ethnic Russians living side by side with the Chechens. There was a kind of a level of respect between Islam and Christianity in Grozny, between Russians and Chechens. They all shared this republic. All this, of course, ended with this horrific war. This is what Etobicoke in Grozny ended up looking like. A lot of conscripts and mercenaries as well were deployed into Chechnya. And of course, as in any war, it's the innocent civilians that had to bear the brunt of this horrific battle, the siege of Grozny, and eventually the invasion of Chechnya overall. Both Russians and Chechens were trapped in it. The Yeltsin's Russian army did not discriminate between Russians or Chechens when they came in to kill everybody they can kill in Grozny. We really have not seen this kind of warfare in Europe or Asia, really, to this extent since the Second World War. And the toll, not only from so-called collateral casualties, but just from outright genocidal killing and executions, is, as I say, in the hundreds of thousands in the case of Chechnya, where, two wars will be fought, one by Yeltsin and then another one, a second war in Grozny by Putin in the 2000s after he takes power. This is what it looks like. So those kind of easygoing Muslims that would, take a shot of vodka very quickly became dedicated jihadists. And now, from being one of the most moderate Islamic societies, Chechnya becomes one of the most radicalized Islamic societies in the region. And the Russians will be paying for it for decades to come, and still will be paying for it, and particularly as these women warriors now take up the veil. Now they stop drinking vodka and smoking joints and begin to take jihad as a very deeply personal aspect of their Chechen nationhood, the so-called Black Widows, the ones that seized the that movie theater in Russia, the ones that blew up some of the railway stations and the attacks on in Moscow, the attacks on the Moscow subway, the attacks on Russian schools in some of the regions near Chechnya. Essentially, what Yeltsin began and Putin completed was the Islamic radicalization of Chechnya. And of course, during Putin's war in, during Yeltsin's war in Chechnya, Putin, of course, at that point was rising up in the Yeltsin's state and would eventually become, as I say, the head of Russian internal intelligence, the FSB, that would have been in charge of suppressing Chechen terrorism inside of Russia. In the meantime, Yeltsin is eagerly and openly and enthusiastically cultivating his relationship with Clinton. Drinking his way through it. They appear to be this honeymooning couple. Yeltsin, in many ways, is a joke to Clinton. Um, Clinton will reminisce how, the grizzly bear, Yeltsin will kind of chastise him and then, make a joke. Ha ha ha. Partners in crime, partners in that pre 9/11 era of American power and predominance in what seemed to be a new American globalized economic system that Russia is becoming a partner in at the price of its own people. All of us in the West begin to kind of co-opt the Russians as kind of the next market we'll be conquering, our next pliable partners. Yeltsin, of course, by 1996 is deeply in trouble, as I say, as Russians are literally dying under his administration with that horrific plunge in the life expectancy. And so now the Americans come in to rescue Yeltsin with the Clinton election interference um, program inside of Russia, which is proudly reported by Time magazine. Yanks to the rescue. The secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. Indeed, secret. This, of course, is the problem that Putin has with Hillary Clinton. It's not so much Hillary Clinton's chastising of Putin's policy, it's her husband's role. And of course, we know that Bill and Hillary Clinton, certainly Hillary was not a quiet first lady. She eventually becomes a senator and even a presidential candidate. So she had a lot of influence in this period. And so she and Clinton are both kind of associated with the American interference in Russian internal affairs during the election of who essentially was a tyrant by this point, Yeltsin, and so it leaves a bad taste in many Russians' mouths who had lived through this era and in this period. And again, here you can see Russian Putin era propaganda portraying Yeltsin as a drunk, a traitor, and a puppet. What will happen now in the last years of the Yeltsin regime is the ultimate betrayal of Gorbachev's reforms. Since the democratic elections in the USSR in 1989, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, in the unleashing of the Warsaw Pact countries, the West had continually assured the Russians that the NATO alliance will make no attempt to expand into the vacuum of former Warsaw Pact countries or former Soviet republics that claimed independence, like the Ukraine, Georgia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus. But nothing of the sort happened. NATO history essentially is considered by Russians of this generation and within the Putin administration as a betrayal of the Yalta Agreement between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin on the future of the global structure in European politics. And the first betrayal really manifested itself um, some 4 years after the Second World War ended, with the formation of NATO in 1949 as an alliance against the Soviet Union, and in particular, the admission into NATO of Italy, a former enemy country during the Second World War that was prohibited by the terms of its surrender to the Allies of ever aligning itself in any alliance against one of the former allies. And so the inclusion of Italy in NATO in 1949 is the first betrayal. In 1952, Turkey is as well now absorbed into NATO, beginning to encircle the Soviet Union and its spheres of interest, in particularly the Black Sea. And you know, I don't need to review all the lectures I've done on the significance of the Black Sea to Russia's Black Sea fleet and its access to the Mediterranean and the rest of the world and so forth. The Russians have been fighting for free exit through the Bosphorus, and of course, Turkey becoming now a signed member of NATO was an issue. And yet the Russians did not respond with their own alliance. It's in 1955 when the ultimate betrayal occurs, where 10 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany, now West Germany is admitted into NATO as a partner against Russia. And that, as I say, after 10 years of growing tensions between the Soviet Union and the West, that is finally the admission of Germany into NATO, will trigger now the Russians to form the Warsaw Pact alliance. That's how long the Russians waited. 1982, as fascism and Franco passes from Spain, Spain joins NATO alliance. Now, as the Soviet Union begins to enter into its final disintegrative state in 1990, East Germany will break away from the Soviet sphere and will unify with Germany and be also admitted into NATO. At the same time, the Warsaw Pact countries all go their different ways, as do the Western socialist republics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Ukraine, and Belarus. This little island you see here is Kaliningrad. It's a kind of an island part of the Russian Republic. It used to be Königsberg, seized from the Germans during the war, and is still part of Russia today. Throughout this period now, as Russia is disintegrating, and Yeltsin is negotiating these treaties, West has been assuring the Russians that they will not insert NATO into any of the former Soviet republics or any of the Warsaw Pact countries. But in 1999, in the last year of Yeltsin's regime, they do precisely that. They allow Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary to join NATO. And this essentially is the breaking point. This is the beginning of Putin. This is the end of the Gorbachev-Yeltsin era, and this is what's going to trigger Russian nationalism now and chauvinism in response to this affront to Russian security. In 2004, by then, of course, Putin is in power, NATO will as well now absorb Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia into NATO, as they will the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria, placing NATO now on the shores of the Black Sea. This is a huge problem for Putin, and it further begins the radicalization of Putin's foreign policy and kind of the rearming of Russia when they realized just how insincere and deceptive Western powers had been over this last decade. In 2009, we'll see Croatia and Montenegro join. 2000. At this point, of course, Russians will now retake Crimea to ensure their naval bases, as the Ukraine is contemplating perhaps joining NATO. 2017, Montenegro becomes part of NATO. That was Albania. And in 2020, Kosovo, just last year, joined NATO. So Putin essentially feels the pressure. And the question, of course, is, the final remaining members of CIS, the Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and so forth. And that is essentially now the line in the sand. There is no way that now the militant Putin will allow for any further expansion of NATO. It's very regrettable what NATO did. You can see the kind of immediate deployment of American troops into Poland, something that would have been unthinkable and should have never happened. At least should have never happened from the Russian point of view, I should say. And so NATO presence, deployment is now pushing right up toward Moscow. Canadians have been deployed to Latvia in support of the Latvian army. This is the same Latvia that is currently celebrating the role that Latvian SS legionnaires had in Hitler's army and in the Holocaust. These former Nazi stormtroopers are now commemorated in Latvian Remembrance Day services. The Nazi Waffen-SS legions are lionized and proudly hailed in Latvia. They're celebrated. They're part of Legion Memorial Days in Latvia, a kind of gathering around the gatherings of Latvian nationalists. And this is the country in which Canadian troops are being deployed in assistance of. In Latvian schools, the history of the Latvian SS's role in the Third Reich is taught and celebrated to young Latvian children. And the activities of the SS are glorified to these kids. And this is precisely the reason that Putin is so, I don't want to use the word paranoid, but so suspicious of Western intentions and Western power, NATO, and the former neighbors of the Soviet Union, despite the fact, of course, that Stalin's occupation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, whatever its role as part of the Russian Empire, they were a conquered people and their own people, and certainly with their own culture and certainly due sovereignty. But nonetheless, this kind of return to the glories of Nazi Germany and the Latvian SS divisions, and the same thing in Lithuania and Estonia is disgraceful that we would deploy our troops to countries that celebrate this. And so at the end, as NATO begins to move eastwards, closer to the Russian borders, to those sacred borders in which, maybe 20 to 30 million Russians perished during the Second World War, Putin gives up. Yeltsin gives up and essentially hands over the reins of power January 1st, 2000, appropriately. Beginning of the 2000s, Putin now becomes the president of Russia. And, he's, of course, altered the constitution, giving him longer terms. There was a period where he stood down for a term, and his prime minister, Medvedev, was the president, but obviously Putin never left the stage. You can see that 15 years of Putin has been very good for Russia. The GDP under Putin rose from $1,300 to $14,000. Inflation dropped from 36% to 6.5%. The pension went from 499 rubles to 10,000 rubles, pension payments. Income from 1,500 rubles to nearly 30,000 rubles. Putin is popular in Russia, despite kind of his tyrannical policies and conduct. Putin will call Yeltsin's oligarchs into Stalin's dacha, still preserved as it was in Stalin's day. And there, Putin will give the oligarchy, the Yeltsin oligarchy, its new marching orders. And many of them, of course, think they're more powerful than Putin, and that Putin is a temporary phenomenon. And of course, he wasn't. The head of Yukas, Horodovsky, ends up being thrown into a prison cell by Putin. The other oligarchs all end up in exile, mostly in London. Some commit suicide, some are murdered, some are also thrown in jail. Putin essentially decimates the old oligarchy and installs his own new oligarchy. Putin essentially is believed to be the richest man in the world today. Hillary Clinton, of course, returns under the Obama administration, and of course begins the first kind of criticism of Putin's policies is criticism on behalf of American partners, of the oligarchs, that Putin is destroying. And so very quickly, Hillary tries to express her concern about American financial interests inside of Russia being kind of abused by Putin. And I think Putin's body language tells us everything we need to know about what he thinks of Hillary and her husband's past role in the election of Yeltsin and election interference inside of Russia in the 1990s. Putin now begins to wage war, not only against Russian dissidents, but what, for the lack of a better word, are essentially traitors to Russia, former KGB officers and GRU officers who defect to the West as opponents of Putin are now just put to death by various nefarious means. This is one of the recent ones, the poisoning of a GRU colonel who was caught spying for the West, for the United States. He had exposed Russian operations in the United States, and in exchange for the Russians that were arrested, he had been released and allowed to go into British to live in Britain, and Russian agents, of course, we were talking about Sergei Skripal, attempted to assassinate him with this nerve agent, which failed. But that essentially is Putin's policy. He is executing any traitor from the KGB or the GRU, and not only those who betray Putin's Russia, but as well other opponents, journalists like Politkovskaya, a noted dissident journalist, is just murdered outright in the streets of Moscow, as are Russian opposition politicians. Denis Vorennikov, who was a communist party member of the Russian state government, is himself assassinated as well by Putin agents. Putin, of course, is famously, as well as remember Nemtsov as well, assassinated in just in front of the Kremlin, in front of Basil's cathedral on the bridge. As Putin likes to say himself, once you become a KGB member of the KGB, you remain so for the rest of your life. The Dark Prince. And indeed, Putin now will return to Chechnya and finish what Yeltsin was unable to finish. He will completely destroy Chechnya as any kind of independent state and install a puppet government there. And he will as well now begin to box in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, particular Georgia, any kind of ambitions the Georgians have of joining NATO will be stifled certainly by Putin. American bases that during the war in Afghanistan were even by Putin, kind of tolerated in the Berserkistans, are now under pressure from Putin. That's the Central Asian republics are a scene of warfare, civil warfare. Some of it sponsored by Putin and pro-Putin forces. You can see the kind of ethnic diversity between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and unfortunately, very few of these colors get along with each other. And just the idea of Georgia becoming a NATO member on the Black Sea would be a cause of war for Putin. And so, as these areas become unstable and again a potential vacuum, it's a race between Western powers and Putin as to who fills that vacuum in these Central Asian states around the oil supply. You can see as well kind of the position of Syria, where the Russians are going to now make their presence felt, and the gas lines, the oil pipelines, and so forth as well. The so-called Central Asian ring is critical to the Russian Federation, as is Crimea here, as is Georgia. Turkey already is in NATO, but of course now Turkey is not as friendly to NATO as it was once under the current regime. And this will result in 2008 in a war as well in Georgia, when Georgia really begins to move towards asking for NATO membership. Very quickly, Putin begins to deploy into Georgian neighbors' territory, where Georgia had as well kind of claims on this territory. The Russians very quickly intervene, and militarily so. And finally, with Crimea in 2014, particularly after those new members are admitted into NATO. And so, here's the last picture of Hillary chastising and fantasizing about, Crimea as kind of being an integral part of the Ukraine, and how dare the Russians deploy into Crimea? They're going to pay a great price, and I think once again Putin's face and body language is exactly indicative of what he um, is thinking at this moment. Putin will now upgrade the Russian military in the way Reagan did. He will as well upgrade the secret services. The SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, billions of oil dollars will be poured in by Putin to build an entire intelligence city, kind of like Langley, Virginia, where the CIA is based. This is the SVR's city in the suburb of Moscow. They have their own residences, their own stores, shopping malls, and that's their new headquarters. The military intelligence, the GRU, is also upgraded with new facilities in more central to Moscow, still kind of on the Ring Road suburb. This is what the new GRU facilities look like. And of course, it's the GRU that's going to be indicted with election interference in the United States now, as Putin gives the U.S. A dose of the medicine that they gave, the Russians back in the election of Yeltsin. And so it's the GRU that will engineer the fall of Hillary Clinton as a presidential candidate against Donald Trump. They'll insert a spy on top of that, Maria Butsiova, into the Trump administration. Well, not into the administration, but kind of as a guest of the Trump administration. Here she is with Trump Jr., and she'll charm Trump Jr. right into the Oval Office when it comes time for the NRA to meet with Trump. Putin becomes kind of the NRA liaison to the Soviet Union and, of course, to the KGB and GRU into the White House. And she'll end up in prison for that, under arrest by the FBI as an undeclared agent. I think she's been returned back to the USSR, or sorry, to Russia, USSR by virtue of habit through this lecture series. Nuff Donald, our Donald 2020. And I guess this, on this occasion, was Putin's failure. He didn't quite pull it off a second time. Didn't quite wasn't quite able to make Russia great again as he did in the 2016 election. But Trump, of course, remains a favorite in Russia. Why not? As these Russian posters read, "Let's make the world great again together." This is in Kosovo. This is, of course, I won't translate. It's kind of obscene, so I won't translate what that says, but it's an allusion to Brokeback Mountain. So I would characterize Putin essentially as the Ronald Reagan of Russia. You know, in the way that Ronald Reagan returned and came to power in the United States to restore American pride and dignity in the humiliation of the loss of the Vietnam War. I mean, that's essentially what Reagan stood for, that, the United States should not be ashamed for anything they did in Vietnam or Iran or Guatemala or Nicaragua or Chile or anywhere else, that, Americans should be continuing doing the mischief they've been doing to make America great. That's essentially, I think, the role that Putin plays in Russia today. He has restored the kind of nationalistic chauvinist pride of Russia. Um, and the only thing I think that, certainly assures me as a Russian is that Russians were never very good at invading other countries. They're crazy to defend their own territory, but beyond kind of the old Russian conquest of territories next to them. As we saw in Afghanistan, the Russians did not particularly perform well as kind of invaders of a whole other, sovereign state. Americans were much better and adept at it in the way uh, they did it and learned to do it since Vietnam. So Russia essentially is going to be under Putin as big a threat as current American and NATO countries will make Russia. Um, I personally mourn the opportunities that had been preferred by Mikhail Gorbachev, um, with mixed feelings. The failure of the Gorbachev reforms under the weight of Russia's tragic previous history is a pessimistic lesson on one hand that, there are injuries that a society or civilization can sustain that will never be healed. And that certainly, I think, is what happened with Gorbachev, as noble of a communist experiment and utopia he attempted to fulfill. On the other hand, the failure of the old guard of the Communist Party to seize power in August of 1991, after a short 6 years of Gorbachev's semi democratic reforms and transparency and free speech, is nonetheless an encouraging lesson in history. In many ways, Russia was healed by Gorbachev to the point that something like a sniper and his commander in the elite KGB Alpha team refrained from pulling the trigger, simply from having experienced an open society over that year, and did not kill Yeltsin, although perhaps it would have been a better result for Russia had they done it. Um, I think, unfortunately, it's Western globalized corporate greed for the bottom line and shock doctrine conquest of new global markets, like the one that emerged in South Africa under Nelson Mandela and the one that emerged in Russia, betrayed everybody from a more harmonious and cooperative ideological, political, and security convergence of our mutual interests in this very dangerously crowded planet on the brink of climate catastrophe. And so, unfortunately, for the moment, we are clearly now in a third strategic Cold War with a newly revitalized and powerful superpower in the form of Russia. We lost an opportunity back in somewhere between the 1980s and 1990s for a better world. So I wish I could end these lectures in a more optimistic tone, but history keeps moving, and certainly, as Karl Marx said, history does repeat itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And certainly we're living now in the period of farce. Thanks very much for participating in this course, and I look forward to doing something else with you. And again, I apologize for the lateness of these lectures and just for how long they had been. I don't know what I was thinking when I thought I could do these in 10 2-hour lectures. It would have been impossible. I should have really divided this course into 3 parts, but there you have it. I hope that you're all doing well, that the COVID era will pass us by, and before you know it, we'll be all in a more traditional lecture environment, face to face, where I can see you all and engage with you all, and all the best to you. Thank you.